This story's full original title is A Journey Lately Performed Through the Air in an Aerostatic Globe, commonly called air balloon, from this terraqueous globe to the newly discovered planet Georgium Sidus. Written in 1784 by an anonymous author using the single name Vivenair. It was republished in a 1971 anthology entitled The Man in the Moon, an anthology of antique science fiction and fantasy. The two editors of that book, Faith T. Pizor and T. Allen Comp, provide us with an introduction to the story with which we shall begin. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. A brief introduction from the editors of The Man in the Moon, an anthology of antique science fiction and fantasy. This brief work, probably the least well-known of the selections in this book, was originally published in pamphlet form in 1784. The author is unknown, and his pseudonym, Vivenair, gives no indication of his real identity, but he is believed to have been an Englishman since the pamphlet was written in English. The story uses the motif of a space venture to satirize the political turmoil and some of the social follies of England in the late 18th century. Vivenair's aeronaut, a man of exceedingly high moral purpose and scientific dedication, lands on the small planet Georgium Sidus, actually discovered in 1781 and named for King George III, which he finds is much closer to the Earth than had been suspected. The society on the planet, as he describes it, is also close to that of the Earth, particularly that of the England of George III. Historians have described the collapse of cabinet government in England in the early years of George's reign. George III, King of England from 1760 to 1820, did his best to maintain strong monarchical leadership in the face of rigorous opposition from Parliament, to say nothing of the English colonials. In 1780, George Dunning, one of the king's most outspoken parliamentary opponents, presented a famous resolution that articulated the political spirit of the opposition by stating, quote, "The influence of the crown has increased, is increasing, and ought to be diminished," end quote. Vivenair was obviously sympathetic to Dunning's resolution. In 1782, much to the displeasure of the king, the opposition in Parliament elected a new reform-minded Prime Minister, Lord Rockingham. When Rockingham died a few months later, a struggle ensued between Charles James Fox, a bitter enemy of the king's, and Lord Shelburne, a monarchical favorite. Shelburne won the fight and became Prime Minister in 1783. Fox then formed an alliance with Lord North, a former prime minister and also once a favorite of the king's. Together they held a majority in Parliament and succeeded in effecting Shelburne's removal. In December 1783, English cabinet government came to yet another crisis when George III was able to defeat the Fox-North coalition and appoint the younger William Pitt prime minister. Vivenair satirizes the rapid changes in ministers that resulted from the continuing contest for power. His story ends on a note of hopelessness. He did not know that Pitt would actually succeed in saving the cabinet form of government in England. George III was soon to be blind, deaf, and insane, leaving Pitt free to guide England away from the defeat and unpopularity that surrounded both the loss of its American colonies and the open political corruption that Vivenair so effectively ridicules. The hypocritical morals and manners of English society and the growing materialism of the era also attracted Vivenair's sharp pen. For example, the English Civil List, a kind of fund for bribes and favors controlled by the king, becomes, on Georgium Sidus, The filifist, or filler of fists, a term used by the inhabitants of the planet to mean sunshine. This sunshine has a wondrous effect. Those who get most of it grow tall and powerful, while those who receive little shrink into insignificance. Tipping of servants, coachmen, and many others had become a widespread custom in England. Vivenair finds that, on Georgium Sidus, his voyager could communicate more than some hours of conversation merely by placing the thumb and forefinger of one hand in the palm of the other, thus miming the giving of a tip. Certain aeronautic events that preceded the publication of Vivenair's fantasy are worth noting. The men mentioned in the first chapter, the Montgolfier brothers and Charles, were pioneer French balloonists. Joseph and Etienne Montgolfier designed, built, and on June 5, 1783, launched the world's first hot air balloon. J.A.C. Charles was the physicist who designed and launched the first hydrogen balloon on August 23, 1783. On November 21st of that same year, 500,000 people, including King Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and Benjamin Franklin, watched the first human ascent. England was about a year behind France in the balloon race. The first human flight from British soil occurred on August 24, 1784, in Edinburgh. Thus, the balloon mania was very much a part of English life, and the balloon was a natural choice for Vivenair's space vehicle. What follows is reprinted from the copy of the original pamphlet, now in the Eleutherian Mills Historical Library. A journey lately performed through the air in an aerostatic globe, commonly called air balloon, from this terraqueous globe to the newly discovered planet Georgium Sidus. Chapter 1. The manner of the author's setting out and the surprising objects he met with on his voyage. Urged on, or rather inspired by the wonderful experiments of late made and performed by those superlative geniuses, Messrs. Montgolfier, Charles, and others, no less to the honor of this our mighty kingdom of France than to the advancement of true experimental knowledge, animated also, as it must be confessed, by that selfishness, the usual attendant upon glory, I resolved upon constructing in the most secret manner an aerostatic globe, not only with all the improvements of the great philosophers above named, but those also suggested by my own mind, naturally fertile and inventive. To effect this great, and I may say, since the event has so turned out, glorious experiment, I went to work in a retired and unfrequented part of the wood, near my retreat, about 3 leagues southwest of the famous city of Orleans. In the course of about a fortnight, by my own indefatigable industry and the great blessing of God, the work was finished, unknown to all my family and even my wife, notwithstanding the curiosity and inquisitiveness natural, as many affirm, to that sex, and of which she gave many indications in the course of my work. And now arrived the time when Providence, for the delight and instruction of mankind, armed me with sufficient fortitude to place myself in the vehicle I had been constructing, but of which my impatience to communicate the wonderful discovery I have made to the world prevents my giving a proper drawing, and without taking leave of my dear wife and children, dreading their lamentations, I determined to launch forth from this sublunary globe either to achieve the most astonishing discoveries or lose my life in the perilous attempt. I had no sooner adjusted myself in my seat and secured the provisions I thought it necessary to provide for so long and hazardous a journey than, after having most devoutly offered up my prayers to the Almighty, I cut the rope by which the balloon was held and instantly felt myself rising with an easy pace through the air. As the day I had chosen for my exaltation happened to be remarkably fine, and the great providence of God had purged from me all apprehensions of danger, the sensations of delight upon my mind at seeing myself in a few moments rising above this world, and viewing at the same time the delightful prospects it afforded, were such as are far above the utmost efforts of my pen to describe. I continued rising in this manner for the space, as I guessed, of about half an hour, and had undoubtedly got many miles in height from the earth, as was evident to me from the smallness of the objects thereon, when, upon looking upwards, I perceived a luminous body, resembling in lustre and size the moon at the full. I kept my eyes fixed upon this object for a considerable length of time, wondering what planet it could be, till, by observing the surrounding stars, the situation of which I was well acquainted with, astronomy having always been my favorite study, I found it to be the lately discovered planet Georgium Sidus. This discovery filled me with the utmost astonishment, especially at its increasing dimensions, for the balloon kept flying towards it with great speed, and here I had the courage to make use of a contrivance I had invented for guiding the balloon, and immediately directed it towards this new world. But my astonishment was still greater upon casting my eyes again towards the earth, for the height was such that I could no longer discern the multitude, the trees, or other objects on her surface, except the hills, the different seas, and the general appearance of the land, the same as when upon the earth one observes the moon, but vastly larger. And here I cannot help observing how greatly those philosophers err, who suppose the atmosphere of the earth to reach but a few miles above its surface, it being far more extensive than they have ever imagined, as must be evident from the foregoing narrative. I shall quickly show also that their ideas of the Georgium Sidus being a planet at an immense distance from the earth are equally erroneous, the extreme smallness of the planet having led them into that mistake. So liable to error are the highest flights of human philosophy. But to resume my journey, I continued rising nearly at the same rate at which I first set out, still making towards the brilliant object which had so much engaged my attention, till I could plainly discern a great number of its inhabitants collected together, and, as I concluded, gazing with astonishment at the wonderful object that was sailing through the sky and making towards them. As I was now not far distant from them, I could plainly distinguish their forms. They were, most of them, of a gigantic size, though differing in dimensions, and had not only two faces, one before and the other behind, but the whole of their forms were the same on both sides, so that, as I afterwards found, the appearance and actions of one side were a direct contrast to those of the other. But more of this hereafter. I no sooner was on the point of alighting amongst them than they ran from me to a considerable distance, looking at me all the time with great surprise and fear, and leaving a great space for me to descend upon, which I very soon effected, without any damage to myself or my apparatus. Chapter 2. The author's reception and the entertainment given him by Lob Joltered, the king of the country. I had no sooner disengaged myself from the machine than I perceived a number of those who had fled at my first alighting slowly approaching me, encouraged, no doubt, by my diminutive appearance, but with marks notwithstanding of some fears. I immediately threw myself on the ground, and by all the gestures I was master of, endeavored to remove their suspicions and solicit their protection. They seemed perfectly to understand me, and having recovered by degrees from their fear, they surrounded me, beckoning at the same time to one of a very large size, who, by the richness of his dress, I supposed to be the king, as indeed he afterwards proved to be. They examined me and the machine for a considerable length of time, turning the latter round and often lifting their eyes up to heaven in great amazement. They spoke several words to me, the meaning of which I understood no more than they did my answers. The king, finding no good was to be done that way, pointed to a building of a most tremendous size, though far from elegant, which was his palace, and immediately walked towards it, beckoning me to follow him, at the same time ordering one of his attendants to bring my machine after us. We were conducted by his guards to the entrance of a large hall, at the further end of which was a place raised not unlike a throne, upon which, having seated himself, he made signs for me to sit down by the side of him, on a seat somewhat lower than his own. The hall was immediately filled with all who could gain admission to see the wonderful stranger that had arrived amongst them, as well as to pay their court to the prince. He smiled upon all as they came near him, but what greatly surprised me, for I sat so as to see behind as well as before him, whilst he smiled upon some with his front face, and held out his hands, after the manner of the country, to be embraced by them, he at the same moment frowned with his hind face, bit his lips, and clenched his backward hands with the utmost marks of displeasure. One in particular, a very dark-looking figure, having his face much covered with hair, with a shining kind of staff in his hand, of a color not unlike gold, and whom I supposed, from the great respect paid him from every part of the hall, to be his minister, or, as he is called here, sublukarf, and in which conjecture I afterwards found myself not deceived, never approached him without his acting the double part just described, and once in particular, as he came up to him to communicate seemingly some matters of very great moment, he answered, and looked upon him more kindly than I had seen him do before. But upon observing his hind face, I found it not only so much the more frowning, but the whole of the backward man was in consultation with a very busy counselor, who was kneeling down behind the throne so as not to be perceived by the company, and by their often pointing to the dark-looking figure with the staff, who stood before them, I judged they were plotting some mischief against him. My ignorance of their language alone prevented my doing more than conjecturing this, as they spoke sufficiently loud for me to overhear their conference. The courtiers, who were of very different sizes, their growth depending, as I was afterwards informed, upon the length of time they had been in the philifist or sunshine, the effect of which upon them I shall hereafter more fully explain, having performed the Niltakarf, or adoration of their king Hihihi Lob Jol Tered, as was their custom, which the name Jol Tered signifies, translated into our language, the wise, the extender of the empire. He is also styled by his subjects, amongst his other titles, Lobhi Philifist, or Lord of the Sunshine. Chapter 3. The author makes himself master of the language of the country, and is enabled to give a further account of the court of King Hihihi Lob Jol Tered. As they have no night in the part of the country where I alighted, unless that portion of time each devotes as best suits his fancy to sleep may be styled such, I awaked in the same degree of light I went to rest in. I immediately dressed myself, and was considering how to dispose of my time, when I heard a noise at the entrance of my room, which at first startled me, but, upon going towards it, I found my attendant there, who came to inform me of his readiness to wait upon me. Having thanked him for his willingness to serve me, I explained to him as well as I could how much I longed to be master of his language, He signified by signs in return that he could present me with an instrument that would answer my purpose sufficiently for the present, till such time as I could speak offhand, and then pulled a kind of parchment from his bosom, filled with a list of characters and words, which he explained the meaning of to me by his gestures, at which he was wonderfully expert, and by which I found that their mode of conversing consisted chiefly in gestures, but was aided by a language somewhat similar to the Chinese, having no alphabet, but far more expressive than theirs, each word signifying as much as a whole sentence with us, and I afterwards found the common people comprehended every sign made to them with a readiness that astonished me. With the assistance of this list of words and characters, and his aid, he assured me that I should never be much at a loss, as they all, from the highest to the lowest, were complete masters of conversing by gesticulation, of which I was soon after convinced, having seen several remarkable instances of it, one of which, for instance, the holding out one hand and gently striking the palm of it with the thumb and forefinger of the other, without speaking a word, conveyed more meaning and was more readily understood than some hours' conversation with us. I spent about 3 hours with him in attaining those expressive motions, in which I became so expert as to be able to convey my ideas pretty correctly. I also learned many of their most significant words to accompany them, so that I rendered myself in this short time capable of asking many important questions, and was so pleased at my progress that I instantly proposed waiting upon the king and paying my respects to him, to which my attendant having consented, we immediately repaired thither. On my arrival, the king expressed great pleasure at seeing me again, and I was so elated with the progress I had made in the language that I could not help giving him a sample thereof, at which he seemed highly delighted, and cried out to my attendant 3 or 4 times, "Uskin periskit!" That is, "He talks almost as well as we do. Spare no pains with him." For 2 words of theirs, as I before observed, express as much as a whole sentence with us. The king now informed me he was going to the Humdelbug, or Hall of Audience, to receive the Neeltekorf, or adoration of his great men, and ordered me to attend him, although I much rather wished to have observed the country and the manners of the inhabitants. I thought it most prudent to smother my inclination for the present, and act according to his wishes. We soon made our appearance there, and being placed, as before, the king on his throne, and myself by the side of him on a seat somewhat lower, my eye was immediately struck with a set of faces quite different from those that were present on the former occasion, but my surprise was still greater when I observed the very same person who had been so exceedingly busy behind the throne now appear before it, but grown to a very large size, and holding the same shining staff the rough and hairy figure had before, and whom I no longer saw in the hall, and indeed the whole company was quite different. This new Sublukarf, or minister, no sooner approached Hihihi Lob Jol Tered than he was received with the utmost joy, and when he had performed his Neeltekorf, or adoration, and retired to some distance, I heard the king repeat several times to himself with great satisfaction, "Lubisit, lubisit, humabais." That is, "I have done it, I have done it. This man will do. He is after my own heart." I looked immediately behind Hihihi Lob Jol Tered, expecting to see some counterplot to this scene, but was surprised to find both sides equally pleased. Whilst I was musing upon this, a very loud kind of a murmur ran through the hall, and upon turning round I saw a deal of fresh company coming in, whispering and pointing with great contempt and indignation at the new favorite with the staff, who no sooner perceived it than he began to tremble and turn pale, as did several others in the hall who stood round him, and with whom he had just been talking and laughing. The favorite quickly after approached King Lob Joltered, and gave up to him the staff he had so long enjoyed, at which, to my great surprise, he sunk down all at once to his former stature, amidst the derision of the whole company. The wise King Lob Joltered professed to be greatly pleased at what had happened, but upon surveying his other face, I found that told a very different story. His Majesty now broke up the assembly and retired to his private apartments, after having secretly dispatched a messenger after the late Sublekorf to inform him that he wanted to see him in private. As I had been fearful of speaking to King Lob Joltered in the midst of his disappointment, I neglected asking his permission to view the country and its inhabitants, but recollecting that the sending my interpreter with my request would answer the same end, I sent him accordingly, who, after staying some time, returned and brought me word that the king was at present deeply engaged, but would consider my request as soon as the business was ended, and inform me of his pleasure. I was much surprised at this, but my attendant informed me that it was merely the custom of the court, which never granted the most trifling request without keeping the party that made it in waiting, and supplication being deemed necessary appendages to the dignity of so great a king as Lob Joltered. Chapter 4. An account of the Georgium or Neoltikarf country, so named from the ancient ceremony of adoring their princes, with some account of the religion, laws, customs, and of the inhabitants. As we were prevented going out of the palace of the great King Lob Joltered, in consequence of the ceremony above mentioned, I thought I could not better employ my time than in taking my interpreter to my apartment and learning all I could of the country I was in, previous to my inspecting it. I first inquired what was meant by King Lob Joltered's title of Lobhifilifist, or Lord of the Sunshine, and why the inhabitants grew larger or smaller as they were in or out of favor with him. To which he replied, then in their world, the whole of which was governed by Lob Joltered, one half was constantly in the sunshine, called Filifist, which answers to our word prosperity, and the other, except a glimmering kind of light and a small degree of warmth near the edges of this sunshine, was nearly dark and very cold and uncomfortable. This he called Grimolofist, which answers to our adversity, by which I perceived that their planet constantly held the same face towards the sun in its revolution round that body, in the same manner as the moon does to our earth. He added that King Lob Joltered had the power admitting into this filifist, or sunshine, or expelling from it, though controllable in some particulars by the great men of the filifist, as many of his subjects as he pleased. What? Exclaimed I. Is it possible, then, that there are inhabitants on the cold and dismal side of your world? Certainly, resumed he, and more than we have on this sunny side, the reason whereof is as follows. When the gracious King Lob Joltered came to the throne, this sunny side was exceedingly populous, abounding in a smiling and happy people, for our former king took every step possible to bring what people there were on the Grimolofist, or dismal and gloomy side of our world, into the shining and happy one. But our present sovereign, who is said to be very religious and virtuous, being willing to promote virtue amongst his subjects, which he thinks the Grimolofist, or adversity side, the best school for, and indeed I believe there is more on that side than on this, has taken every method in his power to drive the people from this warm and comfortable side of Philifist, or prosperity, to the dismal one of Grimolifist, or adversity, to answer the end above mentioned, or some other unknown to us. For this sunshine is of so nourishing a quality to our natures that when transplanted from a cold situation into a warmer, we increase in size immediately, like plants, only with this difference, that when deprived again of the sunshine or Philifist, we shrink into our former dimensions, for which reason the inhabitants of the other side of our globe are a poor, diminutive, and feeble race, but the greatest degree of sunshine is just round that spot where King Lobe Joltered holds his court, for every particular place there is made so as to reflect the beams of the sun strongly upon the favorite he puts into it, and answers the end of a hothouse, the Neeltekarf placed there quickly shooting up to a great height. Whoever he admits into the place of Sublakarf or minister especially increases and rises to a height superior to any of them, and when turned out or obliged to resign that warm and comfortable situation, he sinks again to his original lowness, of which you have just seen an instance, and which circumstance often happens, as there is a perpetual struggling amongst the great men of the Philifist, or sunshine, for this place, and few remain long in it. I thanked my companion for the very particular and curious account he had given me, and was preparing some fresh questions to put to him, when a messenger arrived from the king, with his permission for me to see the country. We sallied forth immediately, in consequence of our license, and no sooner made our appearance out of the palace than we were surrounded by a number of the common people, who expressed great astonishment at the sight of me, but were no otherwise offensive than by staring rather too much, except a few of a more uncivil turn than the rest, who viewed me with no small degree of contempt, crying out to one another in an exulting tone, "Demigraph! Unifiz!" that is, "What a wretched, half-made figure this is! What good can the poor fellow think to do himself here, with only one face?" Not being quite master of what they said, I inquired of my interpreter, who, after some hesitation, fearing I should be offended with them, informed me. I could not help smiling at their conceit, which only drew from them "Skumtokro! Skumtokro!" that is, "Alas, poor wretch, he has but little reason to smile or rejoice." However, we marched on without paying any farther attention to their remarks, and here I could not help observing the decrease of the heat of the sunshine as we increased our distance from the court, which convinced me of the truth of what my interpreter had just told me. We were now upon the point of turning down one of the principal streets of the metropolis of Neeltekarf, when I observed a very large building with the door standing open. Upon inquiring what place it was, and being informed it was one of the principal temples of the place, we went immediately into it. The people were in the midst of their devotions, each with one of his faces looking up to the sun, which they worshipped, and upon which they kept their eyes fixed, for there was no covering to the temple, and the other face looking down to the earth, and as my interpreter informed me, thinking upon the most likely means of rising into favor with Lobe Joltered, which mode of worship was constantly practiced in their temples, and in these acts consisted the whole religion of the country. The priest, who was elevated above the rest and was repeating prayers to the sun, was busily employed, as was evident from his other face, which was bent upon the ground, in thinking upon the same subject with the rest, and indeed, as my interpreter informed me, though he was a Himprophilifist, or bishop, he was soliciting for the place of the late Graf Himprophilifist, or archbishop, and it was thought, through the great interest he had, though he had many competitors, he would succeed to it. We now left the temple, where, though I attracted all the attention of the worshippers, I had no reason to think I lessened the devotion of their thoughts, and pursuing our way through another street, I was much entertained with observing the two different faces of each of those who were selling goods in their shops, their front faces having all the appearance of simplicity and honesty, whilst the backward ones were laughing at the imposition practicing upon the customers. In other parts, many who were laying out their money expressed much dissatisfaction of what they were buying, whilst their hind faces showed them to be highly pleased with their bargains. As I stood at a shop door looking at a similar scene to the first mentioned of these, the tradesman, as soon as he had dismissed his customers, invited me in to rest myself, which invitation I accepted. I could not help remarking that it was well for him his customers could not look behind him whilst they dealt with him. He smiled and told me there was no gaining a little of the philifist or sunshine without using two faces, and if I pleased to step with him to the top of the house, he would show me another who was of the same way of thinking with himself, though in a different line of business. I accepted his invitation, and he conducted me into a kind of garret, where there was one writing very expeditiously. But what greatly surprised me was he had a desk both before and behind him, and was writing at both at the same time. He rose as soon as we entered, but we, having apologized for the interruption and begged him to proceed, he, after surveying me with no small surprise, and, as I thought, some marks of contempt, making at the same time some inquiries relating to me, went to work again, both before and behind, writing at an incredible rate. I inquired of our conductor if he knew what subject he was upon, which, being overheard by the writer, he addressed me thus: "No one can expect, in this our country of Neoltecarf, to live long in the philifist or sunshine without employing every advantage nature has given him on both sides. One half only of those advantages I perceive, unhappily for you, has fallen to your share. But to proceed, an event has lately fallen out in the court of our great King Lob Joltered, which has occasioned a change of the Sublacarf or minister, and thrown all the leading men of the philifist or sunshine into a great ferment and controversy, and I am now employed in writing two pamphlets upon the occasion at the same time. This before me is an attack upon the late Sublacarf, and this behind me a defense of him. They will both be out exactly the same time, and I have no doubt but they will pay me well, and keep me from quitting the sunshine, which, without their assistance, I shall be in danger of doing. When I have finished them, one of each shall be at your service." I thanked him very sincerely for his kind offer, and taking our leave of him and the tradesmen, we pursued our route through the other streets of the town, where I met with many curious circumstances, most of which I forbear mentioning, lest I should tire my readers. One of these I shall relate, however, though I would willingly suppress it for the honor of the fair sex, whom I highly esteem in every country, were I not urged on by that impartiality and regard to truth every traveler should adhere to in his narrations, and which I have strictly observed, as must indeed be pretty conspicuous throughout the whole of this work. Just as I got to the bottom of one of those streets that looked into the fields, I observed a female Neoltecarf, very neatly and, indeed, genteelly dressed, being in what was the height of the fashion here, viz. The hair of the head, as it were, frizzed out to a great width at the top and each side of the head, so as to make quite a partition between the front and hind faces, which, together with the clothes being extended on each side of the body like a fan, produced the appearance of two different people. This lady was entertaining a lover who was very eagerly kissing her hand and vowing eternal constancy, as I perceived by his often looking up to the sun, sometimes dropping on his knees and tempting her by all the arts he was master of, and by pointing to a temple near at hand to marry him, to which she, with a very becoming reluctance, at length consented, and permitted him to step to the temple, as I perceived by their motions, to prepare everything ready for the solemnity. I stood some time enjoying the felicity of this honest couple, when the lady happening to turn her other side to me as he was taking his leave of her for the purpose above mentioned, I discovered that she had been entertaining another lover all the time on that side, to whom she was by no means so coy and bashful, but freely granted him liberties the decorum of my pen forbids me to mention. They were both very well pleased with each other, and laughing at the simplicity of the poor Neeltegarf, who was just on the point of taking another squeeze of his mistress's hand, and setting off for the temple with the greatest eagerness and joy. I turned away with no small displeasure from this scene of duplicity, and pursued my route into another quarter of the town, where the Snack Lizzie, or Hall of Justice, stood. Here I observed as much double-dealing, as may easily be supposed, as in any part of the extensive city of the Neeltegarfs, particularly in a man of the law who stood near me and was receiving a fee on one side from a client to forward his suit, and at the same moment accepting a double fee on the other from his opponent to ruin it, after having visited the different courts of law then sitting, and made my remarks on them, as I meant next to take a view of the grimolifist, or gloomy side of this world. I hastened home with all the speed I was master of to prepare for my journey and put my design into execution. Chapter 5. The author gives King Lobe Joltered some account of the world he came from, and sets out on his return home. As soon as I got to my apartments, I committed to paper the remarks and minutes I had made in the courses of my excursion upon the laws, learning, and other particulars of the Neeltegarfs, a full account of all of which, as it will require a considerable time to arrange, I mean hereafter to present to the public. One part of the constitution of this remarkable planet, however, I cannot help mentioning here, which is that they have a kind of senate, composed of a few individuals who represent the whole body of the inhabitants, and who, in conjunction with King Lobe Joltered, make the laws which govern the people at large, but who in general were so managed as to act perfectly agreeable to the wishes of their king. These delegates were very unequally chosen, some small and insignificant parts of the country, with scarce any inhabitants, sending more to this meeting than tracts of country 10 times as large and populous, and they were chiefly elected by making use of that very expressive sign we before mentioned, viz., the holding out one hand and striking the palm of it with the thumb and forefinger of the other. But as I intend to give a more particular account of this meeting hereafter, I shall only add that a rumor prevailed at this time, that the great and wise King Lobe Joltered meant to break up this assembly and send the members of it to their respective districts, in consequence of their non-compliance with some violent and underhand measures he was pursuing. This, I say, was fully expected, as he had been heard to say in great anger that he was resolved to defend all his prerogatives to the utmost. But this intended dissolution, it was said, notwithstanding by those in the secret, could not take place, as the king had, through his wild schemes and unbounded extravagance, too little chinkafist, or money, left in his treasury to accompany with sufficient efficacy the sign above alluded to. They therefore concluded that this rash step of his very experienced young minister would produce no other effect than that of increasing the majority of voices against him. After I had finished my business, I waited upon Lob Joltered, who received me with a very pleasant countenance, and inquired very particularly what I had seen worthy of my notice, in answer to which I gave him very faithfully the particulars of all I had observed. Having answered to his satisfaction all the questions he proposed to me, I requested his permission to visit the Grimolifist, or dark side of his kingdom, but he endeavored to dissuade me from my purpose in so earnest a manner, for reasons best known to himself, that, finding the idea of my journey to that part so very disagreeable to him, I dropped all further thoughts of it, and desired permission to return home again to this world, which request he having cheerfully assented to, I went to work at my balloon to prepare it for the voyage, and then giving notice of the time I meant to set off, I was accompanied by the king, his whole court, and an immense crowd of the people to the spot from whence I proposed taking my departure, and having finished myself with provisions and everything necessary, I rose into the air amidst the shouts and acclamations of the whole assembly, and after meeting with nothing different from my former voyage, I arrived at my residence, not far from the city of Orleans, to the great joy and surprise of all my family. Fini.